Hi, well, welcome to the SAS webinar, everyone. So I'm CJ Park.
I'm Mike Bresky.
So we're the co-chairs of the Excellence and Innovation pillar of SAS. So SAS is Students of Affiliates of 17, which as the name implies is a student organization within the Division 17 Counseling Psychology of APA. And we have a series of webinars throughout the year. And the next one is actually on interviewing for doctoral programs in counseling psychology, which will be held next week. So just follow the emails, and also you can follow us on SNS like Facebook and Instagram. And also, if you have any topics that you would like us to organize a webinar for, let us know as well.
Yeah, so today we have Dr. Pat Garriott, who is currently a faculty member at Denver University. So Dr. Garriott's research interests include diversity, equity, and social justice in higher education and vocational psychology. He's also currently the associate editor for the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education and the Journal of Career Assessment as well. And today he's going to be talking a little bit about teaching tips for graduate students. So we're going to hand it off to Dr. Pat Garriott.
Thanks a lot for that intro. Thanks everyone for being here. I know a lot of you may be coming home from practicum or have just finished class. So thanks for taking the time to be here. I also want to thank the student affiliates of 17, everyone at Mizzou, my alma mater, as well as CJ and Mike in particular for coordinating this webinar. So let's get started. First, I want to do a little bit about me. And just wanted to begin talking about my own experience and also, I think importantly, my own positionality and how I enter the teaching space. So I am a white, straight, cisgender man without a disability. I'm tenured. I have an advanced degree, a PhD, and I'm financially secure. And so, I think this affects my worldview, how I view effective teaching, and it also affects the way students react to me in the classroom. So whenever I get a student evaluation, if that evaluation is positive, at least a fraction of that is due to the fact that I'm a white man. And so I also just encourage everyone to couch what I'm going to be talking about today within that information. I also wanted to talk a little bit about my experience and how I have come to you wanting to talk about teaching and hopefully how to do it well. So I gained my first teaching experiences as a teaching assistant during my master's program in the counseling psychology program at the University of Kentucky. Go Cats. I taught undergraduate psychology labs in the psychology department there as the instructor of record. And I did that, as I know a lot of you are doing, to fund my education there. I then served as a teaching assistant during my PhD at University of Missouri for a multicultural counseling interventions class. I don't know if you all still have that there. But I also did some work as a TA, really facilitating small group discussions as part of what we at the time called a lab, as part of the sort of intro multicultural counseling class there as well. So now, as a faculty member at the University of Denver, I have what I would call a fairly high teaching load relative to other folks. A full-time teaching load for me here is about 18 credits per year. And I teach both master's and doctoral students. And currently I teach classes in ethics. So I teach an advanced doctoral ethics seminar. I teach an introduction to assessment class for our master's students. I teach a consultation class for our doctoral students. We have a standalone consultation class here. And I also teach a multicultural counseling class for our master's students. So that's me. And I also wanted to lead in sort of talking about why I chose this topic. And I did choose this topic. The good folks at Mizzou kind of gave me the option of what I wanted to talk about. And I said, hey, why not teaching? And there are a few reasons why I chose this topic. The first is what some people have called the Rising Gig Academy. And so there's been a certain amount of gigging or gigification of higher education. So tenure track jobs, a lot of tenure track jobs due to changes in funding of higher education. A lot of those jobs are going away and likely aren't coming back. More and more higher ed administration is relying on a contingent workforce to teach classes, do administrative tasks, as well as other things. But one thing that this has led to is increased opportunities for graduate students to teach. So CJ and Mike and I were just talking before we started recording, and it sounds like they've gained a lot of teaching experience as TAs or instructors of record. And I'm guessing that a lot of you have that experience as well. The other thing is that I think many graduate students, and I actually encourage this, are teaching to supplement their work. And I think this is a good thing, as I'll talk about when I get to benefits to students training. So more and more students are teaching. The second reason I wanted to talk about this is because I think the most common and popular approach to training and teaching for graduate students currently relies on this osmosis theory of teaching. What I mean by that is that I think most commonly our hope, I'm saying we as faculty, is that when we give students an opportunity to teach, that we hope their experience as students and their learning from faculty about how to teach, just as an artifact of being a student in the class, will transfer to their own teaching. I know when I was starting out in my job, I thought about the teachers that I liked during graduate school, and I tried to do things the same way they did. Now, there's some benefits to that. I'm not saying that role modeling is not helpful. What I am saying is that I don't think it should be the only training one receives before they teach in particular. And then finally, I think there are a lot of benefits to students training by way of teaching. And so if you think about it, teaching gives us a chance to use almost all the skills we learn during the course of our training. And so it allows us to use our skills in multiculturalism and social justice, our group and individual counseling skills, our assessment and evaluation skills. And so it also allows us to step out of one-on-one roles and settings and do more macro level work, which I think is really cool and definitely aligns with the values of counseling psychology. So here's my agenda. I like to do these for my class, and I'll do that today too. So I'm going to be talking about how to design a course syllabus, some strategies for facilitating class discussions. I'm going to talk about assignments, student evaluation, both how you evaluate students and their evaluation of you, and student feedback. And I'm going to do all this through a lens of power, privilege, and oppression, because it's impossible for power, privilege, and oppression to not show up in our work in the classroom. So one of the things that I encourage you to do before you even enter a classroom is to reflect on a few things. First, I think it's important to reflect on your identity and role as an instructor. So think about what power and privilege you hold in the classroom. How might that show up? What assumptions are you maybe making about students in your class? An example would be around accessibility and universal design. How might power up or down dynamics between you and the students show up in the classroom? How have you seen these issues come up as a student in class? And how have you seen them addressed? Maybe in ways that have been helpful or ways that maybe haven't been so helpful. How might you do that differently? One example that I like to use is I'd like to use self-disclosure in my classes to the extent possible. And I also try to explicitly address my own microaggressions when they come up, as well as invite my students to point out microaggressions that I may have committed in class. And so it could be an opportunity for you to model as well as demonstrate how you check your own power and privilege in the classroom. So that's just one example. Another issue to consider is the ways of knowing that you privilege in the classroom. And so some questions to ask yourself as it relates to this point. How are you assessing students? So are you exclusively using tests or quantitative measures to evaluate your students? Who might that advantage or disadvantage? Another question is, how are you honoring your students' stories and histories? So are there opportunities for students to integrate their own positionality into the class? Do they see themselves reflected in the class material and readings? And then finally, I think it's important to really kind of reflect on how you think students learn. And I guess what this is getting at here is really your personal teaching philosophy. Now, one thing I'll say is that similar to developing your own theoretical orientation, I don't think this is something that you really have a solid grasp of, especially when you start out. In fact, I probably only really developed my personal teaching philosophy by the time I went up for tenure. So this is something that you I think develop over time. But some things to ask yourself as it relates to this question. So what has worked for you in the past as a student? What have you seen work for your peers when it comes to pedagogical strategies? So how have you seen discussion-based techniques work? How have you seen maybe lecture-based techniques work? And how are you going to situate your classroom environment? So this can include things like how are students going to sit in the room? How are you going to have students sit in a circle? Are they all going to be facing you? These, what may seem like small things, can have a huge impact on the classroom environment and how students learn. So I encourage you to think about them. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about the syllabus, and I wanted to lead with this because often this is the way you lead as an instructor. It's important because it's often your first point of contact with your students, and it also can set the tone. So you can kind of think of this, especially if you're, and what I think is most helpful is to provide a copy of your syllabus before the first class to students, to post it somewhere. It's sort of your introduction. And so it's a chance for you to lay out expectations of the class, policies. One of the reasons I chose the title for this webinar is because often I'm talking to students about things that have come up in their class, like students missing classes or turning in work late. And often my first question is, what does your syllabus say? And oftentimes we comb through the syllabus and at the end say, well, maybe we should say that next time in the syllabus. So it's your first chance to kind of lay out the expectations. One thing I'll say about this is I think there's a middle ground here. You want to lay out expectations, but you also don't want to come across as punitive. If I've got 5 pages of course policies to my 2 pages of what students are actually going to do in the course, that sets a tone, right? It kind of sets up a dynamic or an expectation or impression maybe that you maybe don't trust your students, or going to be more of a punitive instructor. So keep that in mind. In terms of what to put in there, my syllabi are often pretty long. That's because I put a lot of stuff in them. But like I said, I mean, this is a chance for you to talk about what students are going to learn, what you're going to be doing, but also to communicate your values. A few things to think about here. Of course, you want to include basic information, place, time, course description, contact info. One thing to really think about, I think, especially as a graduate student, is how are your students going to meet with you? I know, like most adjuncts in higher education, students don't have access to basic things oftentimes like meeting space or an office. And so try to work out beforehand how you're going to do that. I think meeting with students can be really, really important, not only to help them with their learning, but oftentimes I think those interactions can be really potent mentoring opportunities, even if it's brief. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to a student who said, I had this, maybe it's even a 5-minute conversation with my TA, and it changed everything for me. So think about how you're going to do that with your students. I always think it's good to state some learning objectives. One way to think about this is, what are your students going to be able to do that they couldn't do before? That's kind of a nice way to frame it, to get students motivated and increase their engagement early on. I also include statements around diversity, inclusion, and equity. So I always include what I call a power, privilege, and oppression statement. I'll show you an example of what one of those might look like here in a second. I have a statement on addressing bias incidents and offer campus resources for that, as well as our Title IX office. I include information about universal design and accommodations. I always include a link to our disability services office, to their handbook, actually, that describes the accommodations that are available, what to do if you feel you might need one. And so I think it's important that that's sort of outward facing. So other things you might include are religious and holy day statements. I include a basic needs security statement for students who may be struggling with things like food, shelter, resources that may be important for the class, like a laptop computer, for example. And I also include a name and pronoun use statement around use of pronouns in the classroom. So you can create sort of a separate, I guess, portion of your syllabus for all of that. But I do think it's helpful to include. I've also included a link here. It's to a Chronicle of Higher Ed article, and my understanding is I'll be able to share these slides with everyone after the webinar, so I'll do that. And so this link leads you to a Chronicle of Higher Ed article that I think does a really nice job of laying out what to include in a syllabus, and so it's very thorough, and I think that it's a helpful resource. And finally, we often have what people call syllabus day, where you show up to class the first day, the instructor reads the syllabus to you, and then sometimes is like, okay, that's it. I would recommend not doing that. I think it's always good to have some discussion or class activity the first day. I also think you can use your syllabus and leverage it as a pedagogical tool. So one of the ways I do this is to generate conversation around things like classroom expectations. So I just did this the other day in a class where we were talking about laptops, and as instructors, we know good and well that people, when they use their laptop during class, tend to not always stay engaged. So we talked about that as a class, and I let the students kind of guide that conversation around what the expectations would be. And so, for example, a student raised their hand and said, I think we should agree to not use laptops during group presentations. So that led to a nice conversation. And one of the things that is helpful about doing it that way is that I think there's more of a group buy-in to the norms you're establishing, and it's easier to hold one another accountable. I have found that to be more effective than me standing in front of the class and saying, you will not do this, that, and the other. So just a strategy that I tend to use. So use co-construction as much as you can to set norms during the first class. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So facilitating class discussions. One of the first things I like to do, as I mentioned earlier, is set norms and expectations. So that can definitely include things like laptop use, but it can also include things like, how are we going to address microaggressions when they come up in the classroom? And so I think one of the ways that I've done this, instead of standing in front of the class and saying, what do you want our norms to be? I've found a much more helpful approach to engage the class in a discussion. And the question I usually lead in with is, think about the best and the worst class discussions that you've ever had, and try to identify qualities in those discussions and morph them into norms. And so it often leads to a more engaging and dynamic discussion with the students. I find that when I ask my class to just come up with norms, it often can feel dry and somewhat disengaged. It's like, especially if students have done it before, they can rattle off a list of norms that they typically have in a classroom, and sometimes they don't hold much meaning. So this can be a better way, more effective way to do it, I find. Another thing that I think I have learned a lot about in my work with our Office of Teaching and Learning here at DU is the process of decentering yourself as an instructor. And I think this can be particularly effective for those of you who are teaching courses that really center on power, privilege, and oppression. So something that often happens is that if you take all the responsibility for instruction and for conveying information, you are more likely to be, I think, the target of defensiveness, aggression, and dismissiveness that can come when you're talking about that material. And so decentering yourself means alleviating some of that responsibility and transferring it to the students, just so that there's more of what I would say is a shared expectation, and I think responsibility for learning. So one way you can do this, one strategy that I use, is reading presentations. And so when I assign readings for class, when I first started teaching, I wasn't sure if anybody was actually reading. And there were times when I could maybe tell when people weren't reading. That's often easier to do. So one way you might address that is to assign students a reading at the beginning of the semester. And you can just do this randomly. And so the idea is that each student is responsible for summarizing the reading for the class, doing a mini presentation about it, and then generating one to two discussion questions for the class. I find this is a helpful way to remove some of the focus on myself, and again, shift some of that to the students. And oftentimes, honestly, the students come up with better questions than I could. And so it in my experience, creates more of a community, and like I said, shared responsibility for the course material. And it's more likely, I think, that people will actually read. Another issue that comes up is how to facilitate dialogues in class. And so this is an area where I think norms can come in really handy. Coming back to them intermittently to essentially hold one another accountable for comments and behaviors that might happen during class. And so you might do this at several points or more during the quarter. And one of the ways that I like to frame it, I have found it less helpful to ask students, are we upholding our norms, or how are we doing with our norms? I often get a lot of silence when I frame it in that way. So another question you could ask is, what are we doing well as it relates to our norms, and what could we be doing more of or better as it relates to our norms? And that, I think, framing it in that way just kind of compels students to have more of a discussion rather than avoiding the topic, especially if it's uncomfortable. The other thing is that, I think a lot of us maybe have had the experience, I know I have, of, something happens during class, say like I have made a microaggression, or another student in the class has made a microaggression, and it either doesn't go addressed or isn't addressed effectively. So what often will happen is that will come up at the end of the semester in your course evaluation, which of course isn't helpful to you and doesn't provide any relief to the person who's been microaggressed. And so checking in on norms occasionally can also help you kind of catch stuff as it happens. Not always, but I think there's just a better chance that happens. Much like the sort of working alliance and tear repair literature in psychotherapy, if you're not checking in consistently, you're not going to know. And so I think the same rule applies to our teaching. So finally, the last point I have here is around noticing and addressing white supremacy. So I think some of what I just said, I think applies to this point. But another strategy you might use here is coming back to course content. And so if you've assigned readings for the course that can help you to address white supremacy when it shows up in the class, and so I'm talking about white students who maybe are defensive or resistant, or maybe it's something you did that created an unhealthy or unsafe environment in the classroom. To be able to come back to a reading and say, so in my class, an example would be white fragility. So we read Robin DiAngelo's piece on white fragility. And so when white fragility shows up in the classroom, we can say, I'm noticing something coming up right now that Dr. DiAngelo talked about in her piece. And so it can provide opportunities for learning and applying the course content. So that's one strategy. I think this point could be an entire webinar as well. I will also say another helpful text in this area is Dr. Daryl Wing Su's Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence. And it's an entire book around addressing microaggressions. And so that is another helpful resource that I know we have given our TAs in the past. The last thing I'll say is that I also think it's important to, as an instructor, give yourself some grace here. Myself and a lot of my colleagues would say, I often don't do this well. So like I don't do a great job of addressing a microaggression or white supremacy when it shows up in the classroom the first time it happens. And so give yourself some grace if you don't do it right the first time. Notice that and talk about that with your class. I've had experiences where I felt like I maybe didn't address something the right way the first time, but I was able to kind of reframe that as an opportunity to, again, hopefully kind of model what it looks like to own your own stuff and address it with your class. So you can think about it in that way too. So this is a power, privilege, and oppression statement that I have used in my syllabi. I want to note that portions of this have been adapted from a statement that I believe was used at the University of St. Thomas. This statement was also a resource provided through our Office of Teaching and Learning here at the University of Denver. And so I'll read it real quick. Portions of this were also co-constructed with my classes. So there are pieces of this statement that have come from discussions that I have had with my students at the beginning of class. And so often I'll read this and I'll ask for feedback, questions, as well as any additions or edits that people feel we should make. So the way it reads now is, we acknowledge that racism, sexism, classism, ableism, cisism, heterosexism, ageism, and other forms of oppression exist for members of our class and society at large. Any critical examination of oppression requires us to recognize that we have been systematically taught misinformation about our own group, as well as about members of other groups. It also means that if we are part of a dominant group, white, male, upper middle class, able-bodied, and/or heterosexual, we have unearned privilege that carries into the classroom and for which we are responsible. Being responsible means examining our words and actions and considering how we can be allies to others. We cannot be blamed for the misinformation that we have learned and for taking unconscious advantage of our privilege, but we will be held responsible for repeating misinformation or engaging in oppressive behavior once we have learned otherwise. We will work together to create a classroom culture where we feel comfortable asking questions, providing feedback, and where those who experience bias or other forms of microaggressions are not deemed responsible for addressing them. We will create a supportive and safe classroom culture through the co-construction of classroom norms at the beginning of class and by returning to these norms periodically throughout the class. So this is something I do the first day. Again, I ask for student feedback on it. And so when things happen in class, if there's a comment or behavior that we are not able to really address well as a group in class, I might come back to this and just kind of remind students what we agreed to and really kind of examine how we are or aren't acting or responding in alignment with what we agreed to at the beginning of the class. So this can be a nice anchor. All right, so I also wanted to talk about assignments, evaluation, and feedback. I think it's really important to have a clear and stated rationale for your assignments. And so why are students doing what you have asked them to do? I think it can help to map these onto course objectives or specific skills that you hope they'll acquire throughout the class. I also think it can be helpful to consider scaling assignments in terms of level of difficulty or skill. As a student, I think you also want to think about how much you're going to be grading and when you'll be doing it. So, do you really want to have students turn in those 25 papers when you have the same day you're doing comps? Think strategically for yourself as well, and how you're going to be able to attend to the students and the work you're having them do. Consider rubrics for assignments. When I started teaching, I had 0 rubrics, and now I use them for everything because I think not only does it make it clear for students, it gives them a sense of what they're supposed to be doing and what the expectations are, but it also helps you. In my experience, it really has helped me both figure out and then defend the grade I'm giving on a particular assignment. So I know not everybody believes in rubrics or likes them, but I have found them to be helpful. I think it's also good to consider using multiple and varied data points. So this in particular relates to course evaluation. So your students evaluating you. So we know that women and people of color are disadvantaged by course evaluations, particularly if you're teaching a class about power, privilege, and oppression. And so some strategies you might use to minimize the impact of this is, one, to use in-class reflections. And so one way to do this that I use, that we use in our multicultural counseling class, is to just ask students to reflect on 4 sort of open-ended questions at the end of each class. And so the questions cover things like, at what point did you feel most engaged in class? Another one asks students to reflect on something that happened during class that, I think the language is, that puzzled you. And so I was talking earlier about things happening in class, and you're not going to be able to catch everything all the time. And so, in my experience, especially if a student doesn't feel comfortable bringing something up during class, this can be a way for them to share that with you. There are probably different opinions on this too. I always have students, I don't de-identify these. So I ask students to identify themselves. I find that in that way, there's just a bit more ownership of the feedback. And so, for example, if somebody's constantly giving you negative feedback, having a name attached to that can create some more ownership for it, and potentially open up avenues for the conversation about their experience. So in addition to doing maybe weekly class reflections, I encourage people to do sort of midterm feedback, sort of like a mid-semester or quarter evaluation. That's another way that you can maybe try to catch things before the end of the class and steer things in a different direction. Another thing you might consider is asking someone to observe your class. So like a trusted colleague, have somebody observe your class and write a feedback letter. Especially those of you who might be thinking about academic positions or teaching positions. If you're teaching a course with content the students don't like, this can be a way to protect yourself. And so if the students are stating, I don't like what I'm learning in class, I think the instructor is biased, or I don't like their style, this just provides another data point, especially if it's from a trusted colleague or somebody who really knows their stuff when it comes to teaching, that can just be another piece of evidence. And then finally, I think it's really important to find allies and mentors. I think it's really helpful to have somebody you can consult with. In our program, we have doctoral students who run small discussion groups for our multicultural counseling class. And we always assign them in pairs, just because it helps to have somebody to debrief with, check in with. I was saying earlier to CJ and Mike, it helps to have somebody to do reality checking with every once in a while, if you're feeling a certain way or are frustrated. And, systemically, I think, especially if you're teaching a class that involves power, privilege, oppression content, having an ally who's in charge, who has some power, and maybe understands that not all the reactions to your class are going to be positive. Kind of knowing that and understanding it and being able to place, maybe course evaluations in that context can be very important. All right, so I'm aware of the time here. I want to wrap up, but before I do, I want to acknowledge some folks who have really influenced my teaching over the years, either through, osmosis, observation, or direct consultation and mentoring. So Dr. Ignacio Acevedo Palakovich, Dr. Tamara Brown, Dr. Lisa Flores at Mizzou, Dr. Punky Hepner, Keith Herman, Dr. Judy Marquez Kiyama, Dr. Julia Roncoroni, last definitely not least, Dr. Valentina Iturbe Lagrave, who is at DU and is our Director of Inclusive Teaching Practices here. And our students in the counseling psychology program here who are constantly pushing me to want to be a better instructor, and have had a heavy influence on my own teaching. So thanks to all these folks.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Garrett, for all of that wonderful information. I think that was really informative. So for those of you who may have joined a little bit later, we mentioned earlier that we are going to make those slides available to everyone that attended. We also want to just leave a little bit of time for a quick Q&A with Dr. Garrett. So I think this should work for anybody in attendance. There should be a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So if you have been kind of writing any questions down that came up for you as that presentation went on, you can go ahead and type those into the text box there, and we should receive those and can hand them to Dr. Garrett to give us some of his thoughts. So we'll just give you all a second in case there are any questions that come up.
And also, this is our first time hosting this webinar, so if things are not working, please let us know.
Yeah, so there should also be a chat box. So if for some reason something's not working with the Q&A box, that could be another option for any attendees with questions. In the meantime, oh, okay, thank you, Gloria. Gloria, making sure the Q&A window works. Looks like we are functional there.
And while we are waiting for people to type in their questions, I had a quick question. So earlier, before we did the webinar, we talked a little bit about how teaching a class was kind of like facilitating a therapy group. So I was just kind of wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about what kind of similarity you see between facilitating a group versus teaching a class.
One of the things that often, that's a great question. One of the things that often comes up that I think draw some parallels with group work is kind of illuminating the unspoken. And so, oftentimes in a class, you'll kind of get, for lack of a better word, a vibe that students are not engaged, that they're feeling defensive, just that things are not going well. And so, similar to running a group or, even individual therapy, I think that's why it's good to have some consistent and planned out checks in the process, and to offer multiple ways to do that. I interact with students who may be more comfortable sending feedback over email to me than talking about it first in class, So I think the more variety you can provide in terms of allowing people to provide you feedback, the better. So that's one thing that comes up. I think also just a lot of the group dynamics can be similar. So, I know Yalom talks a lot about the various types of group members, and so that can play out in the classroom too. And I will have experiences where, I may have someone who fits the typology more of like a monopolizer, or even like a group of students. And so it's important to attend to those group dynamics and really think to yourself, like, what's happening here? I've had classes, for example, where we're talking a lot about race, and I'm not hearing much from the white students in the class. And so it's like, what's going on here? And what can we do to disrupt this, right? And so I will use, in a case like that, different pedagogical strategies to sort of force people to engage. And so if my just asking questions openly to the class and having them respond back is not, leading to shared participation, I'll put people in groups of 2 and then go around the room and ask each group of 2 to share what they discussed, in their dyad. So I think there are a lot of similarities in terms of process and maybe intervention too.
Yeah, thank you for sharing with that, because I definitely see some similarities between the 2 processes, and it's really interesting how even if it's the same class, no 2 classes are actually really the same because of people who are making up that class. So yeah.
Dr. Gary, I actually had a question that maybe is along those same lines. As much as we're seeing group work happening, I think a lot of, especially graduate students I know in our program, are doing a lot of their teaching online. Some of those assignments might be group or discussion based. I'm wondering if you can just give us kind of some broad suggestions around some of the stuff that you've talked about today and how we can shape that for an online class.
It's a great question. I, in all transparency, haven't done a lot of online teaching. And actually several of my colleagues would be much more expert in this than I am. But my sense is some of it kind of depends on the platform you're using. Like if you're using a platform where you as the instructor can see everyone, then I think a lot of it is probably similar, right? Like you can kind of see what's happening for people. You can notice things, even if they're unspoken, maybe. So I think a lot of it maybe depends on the platform you're using. But I think I could see some of the stuff I've talked about today being transferable, maybe just using a different modality, so maybe instead of having a class conversation about norms, we're posting them to a discussion board. I think teaching online actually can give you a lot of opportunities to be really creative. And so I'm sure there are things I haven't thought about in response to your question that would be great ways of doing the same thing, but using a different approach. But I could see a lot of it being transferable. Yeah.
So it seems like I don't know if it's something wrong with the technical issues or something. But if nobody else has a question, I have an additional question if you don't mind. So one of the things that you mentioned before was decentering the class and trying to kind of, distribute the responsibility with the students. But I feel like sometimes when the class relies too heavily on student-led discussions or student-led presentations, sometimes that can also feel like not really engaging or not really, doesn't really promote the students learning too much, I feel like. So I was kind of wondering, how do you balance those two? Yeah,
no, it's true. I think you can definitely overdo decentering. You can put on a movie and leave the room and say, I decentered myself. But I agree. I think a mix is good. And one of the reasons it's good is because ideally what you're doing is giving students an opportunity to either critically evaluate or apply course content. Another example is in my Intro to Assessment course, which can be technical, content heavy, and frankly boring. One of the things I've started doing is actually have students try to make an instrument, basically. So I put them in groups. I have them work on developing an instrument, and it does a couple things. One is, we do a lot of critique of assessment in the class, and I'm trying to balance that. And so I'm essentially telling them, okay, you try it. And sometimes there's an appreciation of like, assessment has a lot of flaws, but I can appreciate how hard it is to do well. And then the other piece is, they're having to really think about, and a lot of times they really take ownership of their project and get really into it. They're having to think about, like, if you were to validate this instrument, how would you demonstrate convergent and discriminant validity? How would you demonstrate criterion validity? So they have to talk about those things at the end of the class. And so by giving them that ownership of the project, it can create some more engagement and just sort of motivation to do well and know your stuff. And so that's another way of doing it. I think using different engagement strategies to really kind of try to make the course content come to life is the goal. So yeah. And if students, if you feel like it's falling flat, I think you just treat that as a learning opportunity. You get feedback from students about why it wasn't as engaging. And then, maybe once a class is over, you think about how to do it differently the next time.
Thank you for sharing the example.
Yeah.
I had one last one, Dr. Garrett, since it doesn't seem like any others have come in. So you talked just now about an assessment course, and I'm wondering, I have another question about kind of this balance that you see playing out. You've talked about some courses with really a focus on power, privilege, and oppression, and then of course there are plenty of courses that don't have that focus. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about sort of creating the space to address those issues when needed, when that might not be the central focus of the class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I try to make all my courses about power, privilege, and oppression in some way. A class like assessment is maybe a little more difficult because a lot of it is technical. But I think there's also maybe no area of psychology as rife with issues related to oppression and discrimination as assessment. And so, one of the things I try to do is pay attention to what I'm having students read. So like, it's really hard to find a textbook on assessment that covers power, privilege, and oppression well. So I often have to balance whatever textbook I'm using with what I would maybe call kind of counter narratives of scholars, and typically it's scholars of color who have really critiqued and provided a history about assessment that you don't always find in textbooks. And so, I mean, that's one way to think about it. I just think you have to be really intentional and encourage students, if it's not there in the material, to prompt them to think about, how is what we're learning raced, gendered, and in my experience, oftentimes students have really great critiques that maybe I haven't thought about. And so I think, trusting in your students to do that work is a strategy you can use as well. And that's where sometimes, like, I was talking about personal histories and experiences. That's where that can come into play too. So rely on your students as well.
And we actually have a question from the audience. I don't know if you can see it from the tab, or we can also read it out to you if you like.
Could you read it? I don't think I can see it.
So this question, it says, hi, Dr. Garrett, thank you for your wonderful lecture. I have a question about a microaggression toward me. As a woman of color and an international instructor with language barriers, I sometimes have been a target of racial microaggressions from white students. For example, mocking or laughing at my English, my boundaries being pushed more than white instructors. I'm curious about your opinions about how to address such issues. And thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry that happened to you. Unfortunately, this is a pretty common experience I have found for instructors of color and international instructors in particular. I think there are a few different strategies you can consider. One is, I hope that any and every student who's teaching has a faculty point of contact. And so, I know there are different levels of oversight and supervision over teaching. My hope for you would be that you have some point of contact where you're doing weekly, bi-weekly, some form of consultation related to your teaching, and that you're not just being asked to go out there and do it alone. So that's one thing. I think some other things you might consider are, and I'm not sure what kind of class you're teaching, but I think, using readings in the course that you can kind of come back to illuminate what you sense is happening in the room when those things happen. I, again, think having somebody to come in and observe could be a strategy. At our institution, we have an office of inclusive teaching practices. And I know those have become somewhat more common on campuses. And so if that's a resource to you, I would encourage consulting with that office. I know I have found that helpful in my own work, and a lot of my colleagues have as well. But I think, some of this maybe also comes back to some of the norming you maybe do as a group at the beginning of the semester, and maybe using that as a tool to fall back on when it does happen. If this is an issue that comes up in your course evaluations as well, then using some of those other potential data points that I talked about could also be helpful, just to provide another perspective, and hopefully one that is more affirming.
Well, thank you so much for your, the lecture, and also the, answering our questions. Thank you so much for that. I think we are about time. So, yeah.
Right. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so thank you as well for everybody that attended and for sending in questions. Just to let everybody know one more time, we're going to make these slides available to everyone that attended, and you'll have access to some of the other resources that have been linked by Dr. Garriott in those slides. And also, if you missed any portion of this, it will be going up on Division 17's YouTube page as soon as possible. Other than that, thank you again to Dr. Garriott for the wonderful presentation. And please join us next time around. Next week we have another webinar. Monday. Next Monday we have another webinar from student affiliates of 17. So please join us for that one as well, on interviewing for doctoral programs, I believe. Yep. So thanks everyone. Dr. Garriott, we'll be seeing you.
Thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you.